Hey folks, it's Laura with Raintree Nursery, and today we are at Nashi Orchards with Jim Gerlach,
Hello.
and he is going to tell us all about what they do here, where they raise primarily Asian pears. This is a gorgeous spot you have. You have beautiful Asian style buildings, and then of course all the Asian pears. Tell us about it.
Yeah, well, we've really fell in love with the house. It's sort of based on a 19th century Japanese house. It was built by the previous owners, and it sort of came with about 260 Asian pear trees.
A little additional flavor, right?
Yeah, and we came from completely different backgrounds. I actually came from a design background, so we were by no means experts, and we made plenty of mistakes, and we're still learning as we go. These trees have been here about, I guess they've been here since the mid-'70s, transplanted from another orchard on the island. So they're sort of hybrids of varieties that we know, but we think they're pretty unique to us as well.
That's amazing. And you specialize in Perry,
which
is a cider, technically a cider or
no,
a wine?
It's different. So all of them are, cider's actually considered a wine.
Oh, okay.
It's the same process. Winery, brewery, or distillery. Wine just means you're taking fruit juice and converting it into alcohol. Brewery means you add heat to it. So you can make, so a Perry is exactly the same as a cider, except it's made from pear juice and cider's made from apple juice.
But you specialize in Perry that's based in Asian pears, not European pears, correct?
Yeah, we do a little bit of sort of co-fermentations where we will use some European pears mixed in. What we found is we really have to grow the Asian pears a certain way to make good Perry out of them. Just to manage the sugars and the acidity so that we get a good final product.
Yeah, because I'm guessing they're not quite as, because they're crunchy and they're not necessarily as sweet as most European pears. You have to grow them to really amplify the natural sugars in the fruit.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of that's just because of where we're growing it. We have really, really fairly southwest facing slope, very hot, gravelly, sandy soil. It's one of the challenges this summer is just making sure that we have enough water to keep the trees happy and growing. But we think that really intensifies sort of the levels of sugar. So we've gotten Asian pears from other people, and it's called bricks, or the amount of sugar is way, way low, and we're like, we can't really use them. So this is one of the few orchards where we can get Asian pears that we can actually use for fermentation.
That's fantastic. Now, we sell a lot of Asian pears at Raintree, but it's a fairly unique fruit. I find a lot of folks don't really know about Asian pears as opposed to European style pears. So I'm really excited to be here and have you share with us some of the varieties that you work with, some of the tricks that you've seen over these years to develop the sugar content, certainly some pruning strategies, because these are very happy trees. They set a lot of fruit, and if you don't thin them, the fruit will be quite small. And so I'm just so excited for you to share with our viewers the things that you've learned over the years.
Yeah, we're still learning. Every year it's a little bit different. obviously this year we've really dry spring and then that heat wave, and so it's a fun problem to solve every year. So.
Yes, well, and it's the end result is you have fruit, whether it's little fruit or big fruit. You have a lot of fruit. Asian pears are one of the most reliable tree crops I have ever grown. So that's not a bad problem to have.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons we started making Perry, because we were getting lots of small fruit, and it was very difficult to either peel it or process it in a way or sell them when they were small. So we basically, for Perry, we just grind them all up, press them, and get the juice. But getting the bigger fruit that ripens later in the year the quality is much better. So I'd recommend trying to grow less but better. So less, but you get as much volume, but they're just bigger. So
all right, you have many things to show us.
Right.
Lead the way.
All right.
One of the things that I love about these trees is because they are so productive, you don't necessarily have to let them get super tall in order to get a good yield off of them. So this is, how old is this tree?
I believe this one's about, well, we planted I think about 4 years ago.
Okay, so 4 years in the ground. Yeah. And is this getting to about the height you want to keep it at?
Yeah, this one especially because it is on the edge.
And when you say on the edge, you're talking about in sun and shade, right?
Yeah, correct. And also I really want to be able to pick with like an 8 to 10 foot orchard ladder.
Absolutely.
Anything much taller than that, it gets to be a real challenge, and it's not a whole lot of fun in November or October when we're picking and it's wet and slippery. So yeah. It's a lot safer and a lot easier to be able to have something it's relatively manageable. So.
And so it seems to me that this would be a great tree to be practicing summertime pruning on for height control.
Yeah, this definitely has a decent amount of vigor right now.
Mm-hmm.
Typically we'll do winter pruning if we want to encourage more vigor, and then summer pruning if you want to take a little energy out of the tree and calm it down a little bit. So there's sort of a balance of not too much vigor. If you get a lot of vigor, you tend to have a lot of really long rangy growth.
And in order to keep the tree somewhat smaller, to not stimulate the tree to produce so much long rangy growth, right, I usually tell folks that summertime pruning, where you're taking off like the top 3 or 4 inches of the tree, like last week of June, where it's nice and dry, so you don't have to worry about introducing fungal risk to the tree, is a great strategy so that you're not cutting into heartwood, and you're not allowing the tree to spend a whole bunch of energy producing a bunch of stuff that you're just going to cut off anyway, right?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And I think especially with this one, you can sort of see how these branches, they've gotten probably a little too long. We should have probably taken a little bit of this off last summer. And then you get a little bit stiffer branches. Those branches are going to layer a little bit better. The scaffolds are going to be a little nicer.
About how tall do you let these trees get?
A little too tall for some of them, but I like to keep them. Yeah, I don't mind if they're like 12 feet. I'm a fairly tall guy, so I don't mind picking. But yeah, so it is a lot nicer, and especially because you have to hand pick Asian pears. It's much easier when you go to pick, or when we're thinning at this time of year, just to get some of that fruit out of the top of the tree. It really takes a lot more time to have to fruit thin on a ladder versus from down on the ground. So.
Yeah, that makes sense. So another thing I think is really interesting about Asian pears is they come in these 2 general styles. The thin-skinned style that tend to be yellow or green.
Yeah, sort of Siki types, Shinseki, Nijisiki, there's a little greener. Shinseki's really almost turned white, almost very, very clear.
And these lovely russeted styles that have a real nutty flavor that they add to the texture and flavor of the apples, the pears themselves.
Yeah, and what we found, especially with this variety, we think this is called Imamura Aki, is that this is one of the pears that we pick it very, very late in the year. And it doesn't have a whole lot of flavor when we first pick it, but we think it's one of the varieties that they used in Asia for gifts around the Asian New Year. So they will basically store really, really well in cool, dry temperatures up until January, February of the next year, and then they really start to get very flavorful and a little bit softer.
That's interesting. I had always heard that they don't change flavor, or they don't continue to ripen after you've picked them up the tree, but that's not true with some varieties.
I think it's one of the things we found with perry making too, is that the composition of the sugars will change as they get stored, but it's not in cold storage, it's cool storage. So it would be so the simple sugars turn into more complex sugars as you store them longer.
So here we have Nijisiki, right?
Yeah.
Which is a very popular variety at the nursery. It's a self-fruitful plant. So for those of you who have very small gardens, maybe in the city, and you can only fit 1 tree in, this is a wonderful tree to go with. Because it's self-fruitful, it sets a lot of fruit. So this is a fantastic tree for you to demonstrate thinning for us.
Yeah,
I'm going to step away and just let you take center stage. Okay.
All right. Sounds good.
All right.
Yeah. Normally, you basically want to do thinning earlier in the season. But that isn't always available. I think if you thin earlier, it basically will make sure you have more consistent fruiting. So especially with certain varieties, this one not as much, but you'll have something called biennialism. So if you overproduce one year, then you won't get much fruit the next year. So it's always a good practice, I think, to thin. This time of year, we get really, really heavy branches with this variety. We'll usually try to thin it down to 2 per cluster in the spring. And then this time of year, we'll go through, pick off any damaged or smaller fruit, something that's inside the tree that we know isn't going to get ripe. So the tree is going to put all that energy it has left into creating, less numbers of fruit, but better quality and larger. So one thing about picking pears that people don't know much about, or they always, I think, do incorrectly, is to pick them even when you're thinning. You basically can just take your thumb and just go like that. So you basically lift up and it'll pop right off instead of trying to pull it down. That's especially when these are ripe. They're really, really delicate. When we pick, I usually have to file my fingernails down really small because I'll nick the skins. They're very, very soft, but they're absolutely delicious. These, I think, when they're grown really well, you can almost get some tropical fruit, sort of mango, pineapple, very, very rich flavors. If we grow them and they're not quite as big and ripe, they'll tend to be nice. You'll put them in salads. They're nice and crunchy and juicy. But if you get them really, really perfectly ripe, they have this amazing juiciness and a very complex, delicious flavor. And then the other way you can do it is little snips. And if you have a lot of real tight clusters, sometimes it helps. Or if you need a little bit of extra reach, you can sort of come up and, so I'm just going to basically take off all the smallest ones, and you can sort of see how easy they pop off if you just sort of use a little flick up with those. So that's pretty much the gist of it. So, and generally we want to also prune. I'll tend to prune a little heavier on the tips of the branches, and then try to leave some that are on these scaffolds, because when you get all that weight on the tips, it really will pull those branches down, and then the form of the tree becomes a little bit more challenging to prune in the winter.
Now here is an example of a tree that I'm guessing would benefit from some rejuvenation pruning.
Yeah, absolutely. You can see how old, some of this wood is very, very old. You can, and what we've noticed is on the younger branches, you'll have sort of a time period, an age of the branches that really is producing the best quality, largest fruit. And then sometimes they'll get older, they'll produce a lot of small fruit, but they really won't produce the better quality, larger fruit. I think this structurally, it also needs some help. When we have branches that are growing straight down to the ground, that generally is a sign that those probably need to come off in the winter.
I was just going to say, you can kind of tell the difference between the younger and the older branches by what you're seeing on the bark.
Yeah, so I mean, these two came out more recently than these old ones. This sort of probably had some dye back here, and we took it back to that. But this probably, all that sort of lower stuff that points straight to the ground, probably should come off completely. Unfortunately, we probably should have kept this one of these up as a leader, just staked it up just so we get it a little bit taller and not sort of growing over top of other scaffold branches. So I may take that off and then try to maybe take that one that's sort of arching towards the back, maybe try to create a new vertical.
Prop it up.
Yeah, exactly.
Based on pruning strategies, something like this, would you prune this in the winter time to stimulate the tree to grow either new uprights from existing branches, or decide what to prop up, cut other things off, and then hope that when the tree wakes up after dormancy, it sends all that new growth up into what you've propped up?
Yes.
Awesome. That is how you tell the difference between winter pruning for stimulating the growth and summer pruning to maintain the shape.
Yeah, I think we always think the tree's taking all that energy it makes in the summer and sending it down to the roots. And then if you cut it in the winter, you'll have less branches and foliage for the next year, so it'll start to take all the energy it's stored up and then put it into new growth. In the summer, it has all the energy up in the branches and leaves. If you take it out, you're sort of calming the tree down a little bit. So
That's a
it's just
great
creating a
way.
nice little balance of you want it growing well enough, but not too much, and just trying to find the right pruning to sort of keep the tree sort of like calm, I think is the term I've heard people use that I like.
So look at
Yeah.
these cute little trees.
Yeah, these are a couple years old. These are actually this little block in here. I think there's about 80 trees. They're fairly new. And these are all Perry pears. So these are specifically for making the drink called Perry. So I think we've got 3 or 4 different varieties. These are huff caps. I think there's gin, butt, and we might have some brandies too. But one of the nice things, well, I guess one of the big differences between Asian pears and European pears, and these are definitely from Southwest England, I think originally, and is that you have to pick these green and while they're still firm and hard, where Asian pears, you can let them tree ripen almost like apples. Yeah, and one of the real challenges with European pears is to get them the really, really good quality. You generally want to pick them green, put them in cool or cold storage, and then when you pull them out, then that's when they'll ripen correctly. For these guys, when we pick them, we'll pick them green and basically hang them in coffee sacks. And as soon as we can smell them, we press them. It's sort of like the avocado on the counter. It's hard, it doesn't have much flavor, and then boom, it's a day too late. And then when that happens for us, they become just really, really hard to use. Very almost make it like a puree when we go to press them. So, so just getting the European pears to ripen is a bit more difficult than the Asian pears, and I think that's one of the real benefits of the Asian pears is you can tree ripen them, and they store really well off the tree, even like a cold garage or dry cool place. Yeah.
And you were also saying that the Asian pears, as you store them, start to change some of their sugar composition?
Yeah, and I think the acidity changes a little bit as well. You were mentioning earlier about the one variety that almost has sort of a lime flavor. Pears do have citric acid as well as malic acid, so a lot of times you get sort of nice lemony or sort of lemon peel or lime skin flavors in some of the Asian pear varieties. Whereas apples are all just like malic acid, that hard sort of apple acidity. So, so sometimes pears will have both malic and citric. So you get, if you grow them really well, you get a lot of sort of this really aromatic complexity.
And then you also have some of the sugars that will convert into those unfermentable sugars.
Right.
So they'll stay really sweet even after you ferment them to a relatively higher alcohol content.
Sure.
You don't have to be quite as careful to stop your fermentation while it's still...
Yeah, we ferment everything dry,
Yeah.
but it will provide residual sweetness at the end.
That's nice. So here we are at the end of our tour, and I realize I haven't actually asked you, what does Nashi mean?
Yeah, Nashi actually means pear in Japanese, or in Asia, that's what they call Asian pears, is Nashi or Nashi pears. And a sort of interesting story, the person that built the house, the contractor, was originally from New Zealand. So we were looking for names, and we looked on the old house drawings, and on the drawings it said existing Nashi orchard. And so we thought, what's this Nashi stuff? And it's like, oh, it just means Asian pears. So it's like, well, that's a much better name than all these ones that we were coming up with at the time. So
That's perfect.
So yeah, so New Zealand, Korea, and Japan call them Nashi or Nashi pears. So.
Oh, that is lovely. And this painting has been on this barn for decades, hasn't it?
Oh, when did we do? I think 2008, I believe. Used to be a daffodil, so.
But it's always been beautiful. Thank you so much for letting us come and take a tour, teaching us so much about Asian pears, how to use them at just the peak of their harvest, how to prune the trees, and how to enjoy everything they have to offer.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And I'm Laura from Raintree Nursery. We'll see you next time.